I didn't lie. I just never corrected him. And honestly, if he had really listened, he would have known I never actually moved out. That's on him. Before I walk you through the full story, I just have a small favor to ask. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and let me know in the comments. What city are you watching from? It's always amazing to see how far this audience is reaching. Now let's get back to the story. I met Ethan at a coffee shop near my office on a Tuesday morning in January. I was having a particularly bad day because my ex-boyfriend Leo and I had gotten into another one of our exhausting fights the night before about our living situation. Leo and I had officially broken up 3 months earlier, but we were still living together in the apartment we'd shared for 2 years. We couldn't afford to break the lease, and neither of us had anywhere else to go. It was supposed to be temporary, just until one of us could find a new place. But temporary had turned into a complicated limbo that was driving us both crazy. We weren't together anymore, not officially, but we weren't exactly apart either. We slept in the same bed sometimes when one of us was lonely or drunk. We still split groceries and utilities. We still knew each other's schedules and routines. It was like being broken up in theory but not in practice. I was sitting in the coffee shop that morning, scrolling through apartment listings I couldn't afford, when this guy at the next table started a conversation about the book I was reading. He was attractive in a grown-up way that I found appealing. Tall, well-dressed, with the kind of confidence that comes from having your life together. His name was Ethan, and he was 34 years old, worked in finance, and owned his own condo downtown. He seemed genuinely interested in talking to me, not just hitting on me, which was refreshing after months of dealing with Leo's emotional unavailability. We talked for over an hour about books and work and life in general. Ethan was easy to talk to, and he had this way of listening that made me feel like what I was saying actually mattered. When he asked for my number, I gave it to him without hesitation. Ethan texted me that afternoon asking if I wanted to go to dinner that weekend. I said yes, even though I knew it was probably too soon to be dating someone new. Leo and I had only broken up 3 months ago, and we were still living together. But I was lonely and frustrated, and Ethan seemed like exactly the kind of distraction I needed. Our first date was at a nice Italian restaurant downtown. Ethan was charming and attentive, asking thoughtful questions about my life and career. When the conversation turned to living situations, I found myself being deliberately vague. He mentioned that he'd bought his condo 2 years ago and loved living alone after sharing space with roommates throughout his 20s. He asked about my living situation, and I told him I was renting an apartment but dealing with some roommate issues. It wasn't technically a lie. I was renting an apartment, and I was definitely dealing with roommate issues. I just didn't mention that my roommate was my ex-boyfriend, or that we were sharing a bed half the time. Ethan seemed sympathetic about my housing struggles. He talked about how difficult it could be to find compatible roommates, how expensive rent was in our city, how stressful it was to live with people who didn't respect your space or boundaries. I agreed with everything he said, letting him fill in the details of my situation with his own assumptions. It felt easier than explaining the messy reality of my relationship with Leo. Over the next few weeks, Ethan and I started seeing each other regularly. He was everything Leo wasn't: emotionally available, financially stable, interested in building something real. He talked about the future like it was something to look forward to, instead of something to avoid. The problem was that I was still going home to Leo every night, and despite our official breakup status, we kept falling into old patterns. We'd watch movies together on the couch, cook dinner together, and yes, sometimes we'd end up sleeping together when the loneliness got too overwhelming. I told myself it didn't mean anything. We were just two people who knew each other well, providing comfort during a difficult transition period. It wasn't cheating because Leo and I weren't together anymore, and Ethan and I hadn't defined our relationship yet. But I also knew that if Ethan found out about my living situation, he'd probably have questions I didn't want to answer. A month into dating Ethan, he started talking about wanting to see my place. He'd shown me his condo, which was beautiful and decorated like an adult actually lived there, and he was curious about my apartment. I kept making excuses. I told him my roommate was going through a rough time and had people over constantly. I said the apartment was a mess because I was in the middle of redecorating. I claimed we were having plumbing issues that made having guests inconvenient. Ethan was understanding about all of it, which made me feel both relieved and guilty. He was clearly the type of person who respected boundaries and didn't want to pressure me into anything I wasn't comfortable with. But his patience also made it easier to keep avoiding the truth about my situation. 2 months into our relationship, Ethan and I were having dinner at his place when he brought up something that changed everything. He'd been talking about his work bonus and how he was thinking about investing it, when he mentioned that he'd rather use money to help people he cared about than just accumulate more wealth. He said that if I was struggling with rent because of my roommate situation, he'd be happy to help me out financially until I could find a better living arrangement. He offered to cover my rent for a few months so I could save up for a security deposit on my own place. I should have said no immediately. I should have explained that my financial situation wasn't actually that dire, or at least clarified what my living arrangement really was. Instead, I found myself accepting his offer. I told myself I deserved help after everything I'd been through with Leo. I rationalized that Ethan could afford it, and he was offering voluntarily. I convinced myself that I wasn't really lying because I never explicitly said I lived alone. When Ethan asked for my address to send the first month's rent payment, I gave him the address of the apartment I shared with Leo. When he asked about the amount, I told him what my half of the rent actually was, which was true. The first payment arrived as a check made out to me, with a sweet note about how proud he was that I was taking steps to improve my living situation. I deposited the check and used the money to pay my portion of the rent, just like I always did. Leo noticed that I seemed less stressed about money, but I told him I'd picked up some freelance work. He didn't ask for details, which was typical for our relationship. We'd always been good at avoiding conversations that might lead to emotional intimacy. For the next few months, Ethan continued sending monthly rent payments. He also started buying me things for my apartment: a new coffee maker, some decorative pillows, a set of nice dishes. He said he wanted to help me make my space feel more like home. I accepted all of his gifts and kept them hidden in my bedroom, away from Leo's notice. When Ethan asked how I liked the new coffee maker, I'd tell him it was perfect, that it made my mornings so much better. I wasn't lying. It did make good coffee. I just drank it when Leo wasn't around. The double life I was leading became increasingly complicated. I had to remember which stories I'd told to which person, which details to keep separate. With Ethan, I was a woman struggling to establish independence after a difficult roommate situation. With Leo, I was still the same person I'd always been, just with better coffee and some new pillows. I started spending more nights at Ethan's place to avoid the complications of him wanting to come to mine. I told him my roommate was having boyfriend drama and bringing guys over constantly, making the apartment an uncomfortable place to hang out. Ethan was sympathetic and never pressured me to invite him over. He seemed content to have me at his place, cooking dinner together and talking about our days. He started talking about our future like it was inevitable, making plans for trips we'd take together, and discussing what kinds of neighborhoods I might want to live in when my lease was up. The guilt was starting to eat at me, but I didn't know how to come clean without destroying everything. How do you tell someone who's been supporting you financially that you've been lying about your entire living situation? How do you explain that you've been sleeping with your ex while building a relationship with them? I told myself that once I figured out my situation with Leo, I'd tell Ethan everything. I'd pay him back if necessary, and we'd laugh about the misunderstanding. I convinced myself that the deception was temporary and that everyone would understand once I explained the circumstances. But instead of resolving my situation with Leo, I just let it continue. It was easier to maintain the status quo than to force a conversation about our future or make the difficult decision to actually move out. Leo and I weren't getting back together, but we weren't moving forward either. We existed in this weird limbo where we shared a space and occasionally shared a bed, but we didn't talk about what any of it meant. Meanwhile, Ethan was falling deeper in love with the version of me that existed only when I was with him. The version who was independent and working toward building a stable life. The version who deserved help and support because she was trying so hard to improve her situation. 6 months into our relationship, the lies finally caught up with me in the worst possible way. Ethan had been talking about wanting to do something special for our 6-month anniversary. He'd mentioned getting me a gift that would help make my apartment feel more like home, something I could enjoy every day. I should have deflected or suggested something else, but I was touched by his thoughtfulness and didn't want to discourage his generosity. I told him that whatever he chose would be perfect, that I trusted his judgment completely. The gift he chose was a smart TV, a really nice one that he said would help me relax after long days at work. He wanted it to be a surprise, so instead of telling me about it, he had it delivered directly to my apartment on a Friday afternoon while I was at work. I was in a meeting when my phone started buzzing with texts from Leo. At first I ignored them, but when they kept coming, I excused myself to check what was happening. Leo had sent me a series of increasingly confused and annoyed messages. A delivery guy had shown up with a huge TV addressed to me. When Leo said I wasn't home, the delivery guy asked if he lived at the apartment too. Leo had told him that this was his place, and that while I got mail here sometimes, I didn't actually live there. The delivery guy had then asked if he knew how to contact me, because the person who ordered the TV, my boyfriend Ethan, had been very specific about wanting it delivered to my home address. Leo's final text was short and pointed. "Want to explain why your boyfriend thinks you live here?" My heart was racing as I called Leo from the hallway outside the conference room. He answered on the first ring, and I could tell he was angry and confused. He told me about the delivery and the conversation with the driver. He said he'd been trying to figure out what was going on and why someone would send an expensive TV to his apartment for his ex-girlfriend. I tried to explain that it was complicated, that I'd been dating someone who thought I lived alone, but my explanation sounded pathetic even to me. Leo was quiet for a long time after I finished talking. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. "Nora, how long has this guy been sending you money? Because if he thinks you live here and he's been helping with your rent..." That's when I realized that Leo had probably figured out where my recent financial stability had been coming from. He'd noticed that I'd been less stressed about money, but he'd never questioned my explanation about freelance work. Now he was putting the pieces together, realizing that I'd been accepting rent money from my boyfriend while living with my ex. Leo told me that the TV was sitting in the lobby because he'd refused to accept delivery. He said I needed to figure out my situation immediately, because he wasn't going to be part of whatever game I was playing. I spent the rest of the afternoon in a panic, trying to figure out how to handle the situation. I called the delivery company and had the TV redirected to Ethan's address, telling them there had been a mix-up with the delivery location. Then I called Ethan to explain about the delivery confusion, planning to tell him that my roommate had been weird about accepting packages. But before I could launch into my prepared explanation, Ethan said something that made it clear he already knew something was wrong. He told me that the delivery company had called him to confirm the address change, and they'd mentioned that the person at the original address had said I didn't actually live there. Ethan's voice was different when he asked me to explain what was going on. He sounded hurt and suspicious in a way I'd never heard before. I tried to stick to my original story about having a difficult roommate, but Ethan wasn't buying it anymore. He asked me direct questions that I couldn't answer without admitting the truth about my living situation. Finally, he said he was coming over to my apartment that evening. He said he wanted to see where I lived and meet this roommate who'd been causing so many problems. I tried to talk him out of it, suggesting we meet at his place instead, but Ethan was insistent. He said that after 6 months of dating and helping me financially, he had the right to see where his money had been going. The way he said it made it clear that he was starting to suspect the truth about my deception. That evening, I sat in the apartment I shared with Leo, trying to figure out how to handle Ethan's impending visit. Leo was in his bedroom with the door closed, making it clear that he didn't want to be involved in whatever confrontation was about to happen. I considered telling Ethan not to come, or meeting him downstairs and confessing everything before he could see the apartment. But I was paralyzed by the magnitude of what I'd done and how impossible it seemed to explain. When Ethan knocked on the door at 7 o'clock, I answered it wearing a robe because I'd been too anxious to get properly dressed. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, then looked past me into the apartment. Before I could say anything, Leo appeared in the hallway behind me, clearly having heard the knock. He was wearing sweatpants and no shirt, looking every inch like someone who lived there and was comfortable in the space. The three of us stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity. I could see Ethan processing what he was seeing, me in a robe, Leo half-dressed, both of us obviously at home in the same apartment. Ethan's first question was directed at Leo. Do you live here? Leo looked at me, then back at Ethan, and said simply, Yeah, this is my place. Nora and I share it. Ethan turned to me with an expression of complete bewilderment. You've been living here the whole time? With him? I wanted to explain about the breakup, about how we were just roommates now, about how complicated the situation was. But looking at Ethan's face, I realized that none of those explanations would matter. He'd been sending me money for 6 months, thinking he was helping me establish independence from a difficult roommate situation. Instead, he'd been funding my continued cohabitation with my ex-boyfriend. Ethan stepped into the apartment and looked around like he was seeing a crime scene. He noticed details that made the truth obvious. 2 coffee cups in the sink, both our names on mail scattered on the kitchen counter, personal items that clearly belonged to both Leo and me. He turned back to me and asked the question I'd been dreading. Are you two together? I tried to explain that it was complicated, that we were broken up but still working out our living situation. But even as I said it, I could see how pathetic it sounded. Leo, to his credit, tried to help by explaining that we'd broken up months ago but couldn't afford to live separately. But his explanation just made things worse, because it highlighted how long I'd been deceiving Ethan about my situation. Ethan listened to both of us trying to explain, then shook his head slowly. I've been sending you rent money for 6 months, money to help you get away from your roommate problems. And you've been using it to keep living with your ex-boyfriend. When he put it like that, it sounded even worse than it actually was. But I couldn't deny the basic facts of what had happened. I tried to defend myself by pointing out that I'd never asked him for money, that he'd offered it voluntarily. I said that I'd never lied to him directly, just hadn't corrected his assumptions about my living situation. But Ethan wasn't interested in my justifications. He looked at me like he was seeing me clearly for the first time, and what he saw disappointed him. He asked me if Leo and I were sleeping together, and I couldn't bring myself to lie anymore. I admitted that it had happened a few times, but that it didn't mean anything because we weren't together anymore. Ethan's face went completely white when I said that. He asked me how I could take money from him to support my independence while I was still sleeping with my ex. I tried to explain that the money and the occasional intimacy with Leo were completely separate issues, but even as I said it, I knew how ridiculous it sounded. Ethan looked around the apartment one more time, taking in all the evidence of the life I'd been hiding from him. Then he looked at me and said something that cut deeper than anger would have. He said he wasn't just hurt about the money, though that was bad enough. He was heartbroken because he'd fallen in love with someone who didn't exist. The independent woman working to build a better life for herself was a fiction. The real me was someone who would rather deceive someone who loved her than have an honest conversation about her complicated situation. Then he left, and I haven't heard from him since. Leo and I had our own confrontation after Ethan left. He was furious that I'd been using him as part of a deception that affected another person. He said that whatever weird arrangement we'd had was over, that he couldn't trust me anymore either. He told me that he'd been planning to move out anyway, that he'd been seeing someone new and was ready to start fresh. He said my deception had forced him to realize that our continued cohabitation was unhealthy for both of us. Within 2 weeks, Leo had found a new apartment and moved out. The lease was in his name, so I had to find a new place too. For the first time in months, I was actually facing the housing crisis I'd been pretending to have all along. I tried reaching out to Ethan to apologize and explain, but he'd blocked my number and all my social media accounts. I wrote him emails that bounced back undelivered. He'd cut me out of his life completely and thoroughly. Through mutual friends, I learned that Ethan had filed a small claim suit to recover the money he'd sent me. He wasn't trying to ruin me financially, but he wanted to make it clear that what I'd done had real consequences. I ended up having to borrow money from my parents to pay him back, which required explaining the whole humiliating situation to them. Their disappointment was almost worse than losing Ethan, because it forced me to see my behavior through the eyes of people who'd raised me to be better than this. The friends Ethan and I had in common all sided with him, which I understood, but which left me more isolated than I'd ever been. People I'd considered friends stopped inviting me to gatherings, stopped responding to my messages, stopped treating me like someone they wanted in their lives. I found a studio apartment that I could barely afford and moved in alone for the first time in years. The silence was deafening after months of living with Leo and spending nights at Ethan's place. Leo was building a new life with someone who appreciated his readiness to commit. Ethan was falling in love with someone who deserved his generosity and trust. And I was sitting in a studio apartment, paying rent I could barely afford, wondering how I'd managed to sabotage every good thing in my life. I didn't lie, exactly. I just never corrected his assumptions. But the result was the same as if I'd lied outright. I deceived someone who trusted me, used his generosity to fund my own deception, and destroyed any chance we might have had at a real relationship. I tell myself that if Ethan had really listened, he would have picked up on the inconsistencies in my story. I convince myself that he should have asked more direct questions, should have insisted on seeing my apartment sooner, should have been more suspicious of my vague explanations. But deep down, I know that's not fair. Ethan trusted me because he loved me, and I used that trust to deceive him. He didn't ask direct questions because he respected my boundaries and didn't want to be controlling. I took advantage of his best qualities, his generosity, his trust, his respect for my autonomy, and used them to maintain a deception that hurt him deeply. Now I'm alone in the apartment I never left, truly alone for the first time. No Leo to provide occasional comfort, no Ethan to provide financial support and emotional connection, just me and the consequences of my choices. I've learned that you can't build a real relationship on lies and omissions, no matter how clever you think you're being. I've learned that trust, once broken, is almost impossible to rebuild. I've learned that some mistakes have consequences that last long after you're ready to move on from them. Most importantly, I've learned that the person I hurt most through my deception was myself, because I had something real with Ethan, something that could have grown into the kind of love people spend their whole lives looking for. And I threw it away because I was too afraid to be honest about who I really was and what I really needed.